Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Charli XCX called Charli. So I saw Charli XCX live less than a month ago. I saw her on the main stage at Reading Festival as she blew through so many of the hits she'd either created or co-written, and she was dancing her ass off to ramp up the energy for a really tough afternoon set. And yet, even as I was watching, I had the lingering feeling that something felt wrong. It should all be working. She had the songs to get there, but it wasn't quite getting there. And when I reflect upon her career, where the constant spurt of hype from critics whenever she pushes out another genre-pushing pop project, I'm left with a niggling feeling that Charli XCX has been torn between a couple different worlds for a long time now. On the one hand, you've got the mainstream push where she could absolutely be huge, with a distinctive voice, the theatricality, all her energy, the knack for hooks, a surprisingly deep well of connections and guests she can pull upon, where she can build a whole set just on those pop moments alone, and a lot of them are really good. But that's also not all she is, and where she's mused publicly, she might be better off writing behind the scenes, because the other side of her art is the PC music and Sophie's side, with all the contorted electronics and sounds dragging pop music forward, kicking and screaming, where she's grabbed up so many critics, built the cult following, but not really grabbed the mainstream in the same way. At least not yet. I mean, at the festival, I was left convinced that for a nightclub or a theater show, she'd be far more effective with her experimental work instead of fighting to hold a listless and scorching festival audience mid-afternoon. And fair enough, atmosphere is one of the hardest things for any artist to control or manipulate, especially on a massive stage where it didn't seem like she had a huge team behind her. But at this point, I also feel like I've been watching Charli's hype for most of the 2010s, and while I got to applaud her sustainability and keeping it going for that long, all that buzz, you gotta wonder why her balancing act hasn't quite blown her up into a superstar just yet, especially if the music is indeed good. Now, some of that I have to blame on her team and her label, but when you're an artist ahead of your time with the hype that seems bigger than the audience, even if the hooks are there, well, again, that can be really, really tough. Now, for me, I've never quite been wowed by a Charli XCX project all the way through. More of my lingering tonal issues with the PC music camp that don't always connect, and I've always had some niggling quibbles with her writing. But hey, I do find her to be a fascinating pop artist, and I did have real hope for Charli, so did it click all the way this time? Well, not quite. But the more listens I gave to this album, the more I'm convinced that she's so damn close to fully sticking the landing across a full project that this album, it remains pretty tantalizing. But remember that warped balance I referenced that Charli's been trying to sustain for the recent years? More than ever, I can see this laying all the composite fractured pieces out, and while it doesn't quite coalesce together, I see the path for her to get there. And while I'll freely admit that what I like about Charli XCX seems to be wildly different than all of her fans, I've said this before, but my favorite song of hers is Need Your Love from Sucker. But overall, let me make my case, because this is good, but it should have been great. And the first thing to note is that while I don't tend to talk a lot about her lyrics, I will make note of a slight change this time around. As I've said before, when Charli XCX doesn't really lean into the futuristic, slightly roboticized and warped side of her lyrics, I'm not normally enamored with them, mostly because otherwise her material trends towards some broadly conventional pop tropes, and it's not all that interesting. And that's kind of still true here. We're not getting songs as high concept or alien as Fembot this time around, and in terms of pure poetry, it does mean this album has taken steps towards the conventional. But I'm not gonna lie and say that her frustrated yearning seems to feel a little more desperate this time around. The drugs, the cars, the bottles, the raves, they feel less like a flex and more just numbing deflections. And even then, we're still getting songs like Warm and Official, where she's absolutely trying to show more vulnerability in her affections to get this guy to reciprocate. And when you pair them with cuts like February 2017, which many fans have speculated is an extended apology to her current boyfriend, which after an extended absence they've now reconciled, these are probably some of the most human songs that Charli XCX has written in some time. From the overprotective Blaze of Glory on Silver Cross, to the exasperated moments of actual feelings on Blame It On Your Love and White Mercedes, which are probably two of my favorite songs here, to the moment of exultant relief when she can finally excise some toxic people from her life like on Cross Yacht. Charlotte, and to a lesser extent Gone. Hell, it can't even make the more obviously mainstream pop cuts like 1999 feel a little out of place. Now, it's a good song, don't get me wrong, but would it have killed either Charli XCX or Troye Sivan to actually make the song sound like it was from that era of late 90s pop if she wants to go more on that carefree nostalgia trip? And then there's Click and Shake It, the most plastic and shallow cuts here, and if 1999 feels out of place, these are barely better but from the opposite side of the spectrum, working more on over-polished, cacophonous texture and losing oneself in the hedonistic vibe rather than matching the more emotive core of the rest of the album. But again, that's that balancing act of contradictions, at least in the conversation of production and composition, and those pieces that show a lot of promise but rarely seem to come together as a seamless whole. Because on the one hand, you've got Charli XCX, the mainstream pop artist, versus Stargate, Max Martin, and Watt, and can ride conventional production with plenty of glossy synth, bouncy grooves, and occasionally pulls out a really fantastic hook. And as a singer, she can hold her own there, but this is where the writing just doesn't quite have the same unique poetic flair to stand out, even if she is touching on more heartfelt territory on Charli. But on the other hand, you got Charli XCX, the experimental electronic provocateur, who works with PC music and embraces the whirling, warped futurism both in her heavily synthesized vocals and the poetry that still manages to find some real passion in her fembot heart. More flair and detail to be sure, but along the way, any sort of coherent groove and most of the compositional song structure tends to get jettisoned or obscured for the unsteady, glassy tremors. Or to put it on one way, you got Blame It On Your Love featuring Lizzo in one hand, and Track 10 from Pop 2 in the other. One serving as basically the contorted remix of the other. And let me make it clear, I love both these songs as the best of both styles. But that's my main point. I don't think that has to go into one way or the other. Instead of finding the synthesis in the middle, they could do that. And at this album's best, I see that raw potential really coming together. Take a song like Gone with Christine and the Queens, which hits much of that same balance in the booming synthesizer, the drippy touches, and the spare trap percussion before collapsing into the elongated glassy shards, and even more so the oily trudge of Cross You Out featuring Sky Ferreira. Maybe keep the claustrophobic blending, maybe just up the tempo a little bit more, and you've got a challenging but pretty workable crossover. Same with the faint burbling flutters all around the heavily auto-tuned HAIM collaboration Warm, or the gargling buzzsaw synthesizers breaking across Silver Cross. These songs all feel dense because of all the synthesizers, all the noise, but there is still that same underlying rock-solid compositional structure. Maybe a little bit more modulation to give the hook as much presence or punch as the glassy fractures that on tone alone will draw a lot of attention away from Charli, or maybe a little bit more focus on driving melodic groove, and these sort of experimental flourishes could work better. But it's also something I've noticed about the PC music production team for a while now. More of a focus on gleaming sparks of texture than on tune or groove, and where songs can feel a little underdeveloped as a result if the layers aren't stacked so deep, which is why when Charli wrestles control of these tones into a real structure, we get some of the most striking moments. But when she can't, we get the overmixed, underwritten, blaring bangers of Click and Shake It, which I get it, they're not for me, they'll absolutely please the diehards, but I think they actually could work for me if PC music texture, even if with that sound they were given a stable low end or some sense of modulation the same way that, say, Laserbeak and Paper Tiger gave Shredders, or at the very least not feature collaborators who only ramp up the obnoxiousness to intolerable levels like Tommy Cash and Brooke Candy. Kim Petras and Cupcake, they're enough, more focus on them. But for this project as a whole, it's hard for me not to listen to Charli and not hear these contradictions and compromises forced by a label that I'm now convinced doesn't know how to guide or market Charli XCX worth a damn. But even if she was on Warp or Sub Pop instead of Asylum, I'm also very much aware that I'm not really among the diehard fans who love all the PC music contortions and who hate all the mainstream concessions, or among the larger fan base who only really knows Charli XCX for I Love It or Fancy and Boom Clap and can't really process the harsh electronics. They both exist, both fan bases. And while I am convinced that there is a synthesis that can be experimental and hold that crossover and finally pay off the never-ending stream of hype, Charli's not that. But the pieces are there, and with the more emotionally expressive writing, it's got weight, even minus some of the poetic artifice. So yeah, it's absolutely good, and it's why I'm giving this a 7 out of 10 and a recommendation, with the hope that maybe a change of management, or ethos, or even label, that it might be on the horizon, or at the very least, Charli XCX is allowed some clarity to chase her vision without getting torn in a half dozen different directions, be it from her label or the PC music camp. Allow her to chart her own path and find success at the end of it. But you know what? The Tears did make some good songs this time around, but let's see there be some greatness, because I know she's got it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. Again, I imagine this might be a little bit contradictory in how it'll be received by a lot of Charli XCX's fan base, but I kind of expect that. I'm kind of on the outside looking in there. I understand that too. But if you want to buy or stream it, links down in the description below. And I get the poll up there. I am curious where people are going to ultimately fall on this album, especially given I've heard some mixed things, even from the diehards. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you're looking for more reviews, or maybe the next episode of Billboard Breakdown, it's in the card right over there. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.